Hello, everyone. We are continuing the conversation today and continuing to explore the question of whether, and if so, how, we might consider a rebrand of corporate DEI to move us from that place of DEI fatigue that we're seeing ourselves in now, where there's a lot of talk that makes people think that a lot is being done, but that the actual data showing change being affected is not growing at the pace that DEI practitioners like myself would like to see. And sharing their insights with me today is Mr. Darren Woolley. Darren is the founder and global CEO of Trinity P3. And Trinity P3 is a marketing and advertising management consultancy. So I like to think of Darren as the guy that sits on top of all of the ad guys and directs them and supports them and the industry in maximizing their impact and managing distressed budgets to create campaigns and maintain the global high standards of the industry for their global clients. Now, Darren works with half of the top 100 advertising agencies in the world and their clients. So they're pretty good creds to have this discussion with. Darren, welcome to Unbiased.
Thanks, Darcy. Good to be here, and this is a really important conversation to have from my perspective.
It certainly is. And in the DEI biz, we are very much open to and rely on the support of allies in this space. But we also have a healthy suspicion of allies who self-define themselves. And quite frankly, I'm going to call it at this stage and at this early stage of the podcast to say allies who look and sound like you, Darren. And so as we get started, I'd love you to share your story, but tell us a bit about why our fears should be alleviated and that you really are an ally in this space that would have some insights on both sides of the equation.
Well, look, thank you for the opportunity. The first thing I'd say is that, yes, I'm a white, older, privileged male. I have had a very successful career and continue to enjoy that. I have significant influence, as you highlighted, with various people operating in the advertising and marketing area. What I'd say, though, is I sit in a position of having personal experience through my choice of life partner. My wife is Chinese. My children are therefore considered to be half and half, Chinese and Australian. And it makes me constantly aware of how far, as a society in Australia, which has prided itself as being a multicultural society, we have to go. That it's not egalitarian. It lacks equality. That there are, people that are worse off because of where they were born, the religion that they follow. And look, I share that and immediately I'm worried because every time anyone shares personal experience and you're a white male, there's a pile on which you should be able to see this without having to have it as a personal experience. But just as everyone has their lived experience, I'm sharing my lived experience and acknowledging that it does come from a privileged position, but it's still my lived experience. And it opened my eyes to the fact that what I enjoy is not necessarily what's available to everyone else.
Yes, thank you for sharing that, Darren, because this is a really nuanced topic. And part of my struggle with this, and even coming to this conversation of a rebrand of DEI, you're trying to find the right middle ground behind acknowledging the complexity and nuance in this topic and the inclusion in and of itself, which is sort of so deeply socially embedded in terms of the norms that we find ourselves now trying to battle against for equity in the corporate workplace. But marrying that with the fact that we live in a digital, very fast-paced global world that is driven by big tech, social media, engagement, sound bites, hacks. And so this is the context in which I come to you as someone who has built up a career in building brand awareness, in selling products, in selling a vision and a theme. But to your point, everyone's lived experience is a valid one. And now I operate very much I live my life in this echo chamber surrounded by people with varied lived experiences and people that advocate in this space, but for whom they just see it as an absolute no-brainer. For us, diversity, equity, and inclusion is just an absolute necessity, whether it's for performance, whether it's for innovation and adapting and resilience through change, or to address social injustices. So how then do you act to try and close the gap that sits between my echo chamber and, quite frankly, an echo chamber that does exist with people that maybe look like you, who don't agree with that, and who actually, the closer we get to shifting the needle, the more they may dig their heels in to resist change. Now, there are some that would call me a bit of a traitor for seeking your guidance on this, but yet I know that our paths have crossed through acknowledging each other's work in this space. And I know this is something that you write and publicize and talk about a lot in the context of your business. So I'm interested in, I guess, a couple of things from that, Darren. One, how your shared views on inclusion has been received within your industry. Because some of us are told, we're going to appoint a white guy as the global head of diversity because those in leadership will listen to them. So I'm keen to know if, from your experience, if that is the case. And then it kind of goes on to that next stage. The first port of call to tackle is how we bridge that divide between a sense of them and us, or a sense that some people's lived experiences are more valuable than others.
Okay, so look, there's two really important things, and I will get to those. The first thing I'd like to say is that I think particularly diversity and inclusion, the problem is that the way that diversity has been framed, particularly in the corporate world, is become almost like a checklist to make sure that we have diversity. I would rather talk about representation. How do we ensure that an organisation or a business represents the customers and the people that they work with on a day-to-day basis? How do we ensure that within our organisation we have the people in the positions that are able to share their lived experiences and their ideas and their thinking, and particularly in the creative industries such as advertising, but the performing arts and keep going. Because representation is so important, to represent the great multitude of differences that exist. It's one of the great things about the human condition is that we're not all the same on any level, macro or even micro. Everyone has their own story. So that's the first thing. I think we need to stop telling people that somehow there's the right formula for diversity. The thing is that the benefit of diversity is that it actually improves the performance of innovation and almost all businesses when the team, the culture of that business reflects the customer base. Okay?
Yeah.
So look at, country by country, every country has its own cultural diversity. You could be in the US where there's a multitude of different religions and race and countries of origin and age and educational standards, or you could be in Japan, which is close to a monoculture. The thing is that there is not a particular formula for every country on diversity, but representation there is. Secondly, I think much more important than diversity is talking about inclusion. because you can have all the tick boxes. And to your point about, how many times have we seen someone appointed to a really important role of overseeing DE&I within an organisation, and that being diminished by going, well, that was the diversity appointment, the opposite of what you just said.
Yeah.
That we'll appoint the white guy because the white guy will get listened to, but then you see an organisation that appoints someone who's a person of colour, a woman, maybe fully and more experienced than they need, but is diminished by the fact that it's considered a diversity appointment. Because
Yeah.
here's the thing, how can one person necessarily represent all life experiences in the full diversity of life? So whether it's they're white or a person of colour or whatever it is, how can they represent age? How can they represent religion? I think it's about a cultural change that we're looking for. We're wanting people to realise the benefits, and that's marketing 101. Stop telling people what to do and start showing them the benefits of their behaviour change. Actively encourage people to bring diversity about in their organisation because they'll be more innovative, more creative, more representative of their customer base, and therefore build greater engagement with all of the people that are part of their customers, and bring about inclusion because that improves productivity, where people are spending less time worrying or fighting or playing the politics of diversity, of race or politics or culture. They're going to be much more focused and operating more collaboratively as a team.
Okay. Yeah, preaching to the converted with a lot of that, Darren.
Well, sorry, I don't think I am, because too often the view from the C-suite is that we have to do this because it's the right thing to do, and if we don't do it, there'll be a pile on and we'll be blamed for failure. There is no talk about the benefits. There is much more focus on the downside of not doing it. And we see that, to your point, because of social media, the media generally. It's everyone loves a fight. Everyone
Yeah.
loves to point the finger at the bad guy. The thing is that you're just entrenching in the culture wars, the them and us mentality, which will never achieve the objective.
Yeah. And now, on one hand, when I say you're preaching to the converted, that was identifying myself. But on the other hand, I have seen and tried many similar attempts to really speak to the benefits. And there is quite a lot of data that comes out that seeks to link the level of inclusion to productivity, to engagement, and similar factors. Maybe a point that I want to touch on that I think that could potentially be inhibiting the actual effective progress and moving through that piece that I mentioned in the intro of that. There's a lot of talk. DEI is in there and it's coming up at the C-suite and every other board meeting in some shape or form, even if it is with a rolled eyes or what are the boxes that we need to tick here. What are your thoughts on the idea of inclusion having this perception of being a zero-sum game? That if I am to elevate people who are underrepresented, that necessarily means someone or myself is going to have to come down to that same level.
And that's coming from a mentality of scarcity, that there is a scarcity, and it's almost anti-business, because business is about growth. Successful businesses grow. And when the pie gets bigger, there should be more to feed everyone. So seeing diversity and inclusion as part of the strategy to grow the pie by providing greater representation, greater insights, innovation, greater creativity, greater perspectives, that these are all strategies to actually grow that pie. If you're worried about your position, you're probably not a leader. If it's all about the power grab and holding on to power, a true leader looks for opportunities of growing their power base by actually becoming more important. How do you become more important in business? Grow the business.
Yeah. Now, on one hand, I fear that there are a lot of leaders that exist today that aren't actually true leaders. And then there's a whole other industry that's growing out of, inclusive leadership and trying to embed those principles in those that haven't shared that mindset. But we're hearing a few things now in terms of what the way forward is, moving from that scarcity to growth to abundance, that it's not a zero-sum game. It's actually pro-business if we can look at it in the right way, that we need to foster this sense of collective benefit. It's not this them and us. And we need to move a bit from that purist diversity. And I feel like what has almost become more of a change management style, or kind of the industry seems to have grown into that, right? With diversity, we have targets and quotas and we can fit everything neatly into a framework, when actually we're looking at something a bit broader in order to address both social inequity and productivity and innovation and navigating change in business. So now if I'm coming to you to get me the guys for that campaign that speaks to both and to all of those things, and can try to shift that needle where one message can be heard in different ways by each of those siloed echo chambers. Where are we going with this?
So the first thing I'd say, and a book that I found absolutely, life-changing, believe it or not, is Homo Sapiens by, I think it's Dr. or Professor Yuval Noah Harari.
Yes.
The
Yep.
history of human beings.
Yeah.
We are an amazing species. We've literally changed the world. We have the power to change the world to suit whatever it is we want. We also have the power to destroy the world. But if we focus on the things that we've achieved as a species of animal on this world, anything is possible. But what it requires is for collective belief. The collective belief that diversity, equity, and inclusion actually makes the world a better place seems to be the strategy that should be there. You talk about whether it's transformation or change management. This is the underlying strategy. We need to work towards people actually understanding, and I think most people will interact with other Homo sapiens on the basis of equality on a one-on-one basis. Even the most ardent racist will probably find themselves, if they look carefully, having quite, sociable relationships with people that are not exactly like themselves on some measure. Okay? So we have that capacity. What we don't have is the ability to accept difference collectively. And that's a big issue that may or may not be possible through an advertising campaign. I'm not sure that the cultural change we need is necessarily going to be solved with advertising, but I think it's absolutely going to be solved by communications of constantly reminding each other of the benefits of inclusion and the importance of diversity, rather than making it a formula that we all have to, and championing those that are actually proving the concept, rather than the individual, but the organisations.
Yeah. And how, though, does that need to, and I don't disagree, it's going to be that continuous reminder, because what we do see, and I also have read Sapiens and find it extremely fascinating to see actually that the human race has actually developed because of our ability to work together, to communicate. We're actually not the strongest in the pack without our collective mind ability. But in some ways, it's quite, and it might be intended by the book, but it's quite alarming to the extent that we're able to create a narrative and a story and a reality that everyone will buy into in order to keep progressing, in order to, whether it's to control people. I mean, it really brings down everything from money to religion, and that's kind of molded our corporate workplace. And so there's a couple of things, which is one, I suppose, how long, if we've embedded, it's humans that have managed to embed the degree of inequity that we find ourselves into today. And it's going to have to be humans that get ourselves back out of it. But in some ways, we're trying this, coming at it from all angles, leaping on opportunities to show and share our stories, to share the impacts of change. And that is almost, for me, part of the reason why we're having this DEI fatigue that we're hearing now. There is this lot of talk, and now there's this pushback because we're like, aren't we done with this yet? So maybe I need support in how we can actually communicate the degree to which we need incessant communication on this topic. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, and I think it's because it's been the same narrative for a long time. But that you need to evolve the narrative. You need to move from telling people what's wrong and then sharing with them what they could be doing about it, to then championing those that are actually doing things, holding up, creating fear of missing out amongst business leaders, that if they're not doing this, it's such a powerful thing. The other problem we have, and you touched on this at the introduction, which is we live in a cultural war at the moment, driven by social media and manipulated by those in power to want to maintain the status quo by turning us and making us fight against each other on almost every issue.
Yep.
There will eventually be fatigue for that. There is only so much hatred and distrust that human beings can walk around with. So then to offer a solution, and preach in many ways a gospel of a better way of inclusion and acceptance and diversity, or I'd prefer to say representation.
Mm-hmm.
I think representation is a much more inclusive term, because diversity is, let's pick the differences when we know human beings are fearful of difference. We're a strange beast that loves new but hates change. So how do we make us buy into the novelty of being different, of doing things a different way, with the promise of a better outcome? This would be if you're putting together a strategy document, that's really the nub of the problem, is how do we get people to embrace the change and support them in doing that? How do we make their experience of the world better by actually enjoying the benefits that diversity and inclusion bring?
Yeah.
I'm sounding very, sort of holy, but, and saying, but I find that, white older men are scared.
Yeah.
In the same way that a person from a minority would be scared. It's weird that what we're actually experiencing here is people having exactly the same emotional response to the situation. One feels threatened, the other feels threatened, but they can't find any common ground. The common ground is, what's in it for both of us if we overcome our fear?
I was reading something recently about actually how we change minds, and that persuasion piece, and I think the author had interviewed people from crisis negotiators to and diplomats and people responsible for various peace processes over the world, and they touched on something that resonated with me from what you were just saying about actually moving to that place of emotion and feeling, which moves us out of that pure, diversity and a quota and numbers kind of space. But also, you've raised an interesting point about leaning into each of those emotions and understanding what each people's either desired fear or outcome is, and working to that commonality. Because, as it may be, there has to be fear on both sides. Otherwise, this would be a much clearer path. The point is that we have all this friction to affecting change. Now, on one hand, a big takeaway from what I'm hearing from you, and I'm sure must be true, is that this is a really long game, and it does require a lot of stamina for those who are really actively involved on a day-to-day basis in trying to shift that needle. And it requires, as you say, far more than just an advertising campaign, but it does require an attack from multiple angles. And whether it's appealing to the consumer in us and the capitalist in us, or whether it's affecting, policy changes that kind of keep that discussion moving forward. When we share that and when we think about how people feel on either side, and I even know from coaching one-on-one CEOs who are genuinely actually quite confused or lack a shared understanding of what all the terminology around inclusion means, and are actually interested and care, but are actually now too afraid to ask those questions publicly for fear of being cancelled, for fear of being told you ought to know, you've got to go back and do the work yourself. And they're actually genuinely come to me sort of not knowing quite where to start. It's like, I will do the work, but I don't know where to start. So how do you use sort of stories in order to try and find some of those commonalities, Darren?
Yeah, look, and the important part of what you just said for me is this is an emotional response. Human beings are cognitively lazy. We know that from all of the science, all of the medicine, is that we don't really like thinking a lot. But we've evolved over 200,000 years to rely on our emotions. So we need to appeal to those emotions. We need to make people feel something different. Storytelling is a fabulous way of doing that, because storytelling is not about conveying facts and figures. Storytelling is about leaving me with an emotion, leaving me with a feeling about the issue that could be whatever I like. It could be fear, it could be horror, it could be joy, whatever the story is. But it's incredibly powerful in persuading people to feel something. I read the articles about diversity particularly, and there's all these numbers, but it doesn't mean anything until the article gets to the personal stories, and sharing what someone's lived experience is. That has much more impact than any number of numbers, any amount of data, no matter how correct it is or how big the data set is. We are human beings. We are emotional creatures. No one, we say in marketing all the time, no one makes a logical decision. We make emotional decisions and then rationalize them with logic and fact, because no one wants to admit that they are emotional, particularly in business. And yet a lot of what we see, the issue about funding women's startups and how little funding they get, yet all of the data shows that women-founded businesses are usually more successful than the ones by men. There's the fact, but it doesn't convince the largely male investor base, because it's a fact. Make them feel something. Make them feel they're missing out if they don't do it, or that their competitors are going to get that opportunity that they're missing out on. Fear is a great motivator. Where it doesn't motivate is where two sides are both fearful of each other. There's no communication. We've got to open those by sharing the common experience of human beings. on
Yeah.
an emotional level. And that's where storytelling's, incredibly powerful.
Yeah. Shame also strikes me as an emotion that can be very inhibitive to change. I'm very persuaded by really openly shifting that focus onto feeling and emotion, and storytelling, and sort of calling out the fact that we can show all the data. I suppose it goes to some of my initial challenges of, well, I can show you all this data that shows that your teams will work better, or to your startup example, we can show you all the data on women-led startups, and yet when you're in the room, these venture capitalists will go for an alternative option, even when they say that they're just numbers guys. So that is one thing. That is one that I will lean on. And I'm reminded of a question that I'm not sure you answered earlier, Darren. And that was that I want to kind of see how effective your own efforts in this space have been, because I know you share a lot about it within your industry. And how well received is your sharing on inclusion?
Look, because of my position, I don't get a lot of pushback, but I
Right.
also don't
Yeah.
get a lot of acceptance.
Okay.
It becomes very easy to resist change by doing nothing, which is my greatest frustration. But I see this as always a long-term change. Nothing happens overnight. You know but by a consistent stand. So one of the things we do is we have, every time we put an agency into consideration for new business, we ask them to sign a a statutory declaration that needs to be witnessed by a lawyer. So it's a legal document which has the agency commit to particular things, workplace safety, diversity and inclusion, and the like, and the use of NDAs to gag people. So that
Yeah.
it covers quite a lot of the things that we think are important. Now, people say to me, well, how has it changed things? It's certainly, every time someone has to sign that, they have to consciously make a decision about it. So it raises the issues for them. And,
Yeah.
we've been doing it 2 years now, and we'll continue to do it. I say to people, we will do it until there is evidence that it's not needed anymore. That could be 10 years or 5 years or 20 years. But, it's making a stand and being in a place of saying this is what we stand for, and not giving up just because people are not either actively embracing it or actively rejecting it.
Yep, I like that. You just make something the norm until it is the norm. And as I've said before, I think a really big takeaway is that it's a long game. I will continue to have these conversations. I am so delighted that people like you will also continue to have those conversations and try and start to slowly shift that mindset from confusion or judgment to curiosity. And so that's really a big part of why I launched this podcast, Darren. So it's been really insightful to hear your take on these things, and this will be one of many conversations I'm having around this space, and also delving deeper into those biases and what it is about us that makes us react in the way that we do. And a big part of this podcast, and as we've shared in this conversation itself, we are likely to have a lot more questions than answers as we keep moving along this journey. So to wrap up for us, Darren, can you leave us with a question of yours that remains unanswered, however many experts may be weighing in on this topic?
Okay, so Darshi, I have a number of procurement people, particularly
Right.
in the US, that
Right.
contact me because we do benchmarking around things like, agency fees and the like. But they ask, have you got a benchmark for diversity, equity and inclusion? And my answer is no. But I'm wondering, first of all, does anyone? And if they do, on what basis is it actually going to be productive to benchmark people on them doing something rather than actually changing their culture? That's my question.
Okay, so Darren Woolley's question for the world, yet waiting an answer, is DEI benchmarking. What does it look like? Can it be productive? Does it have a place in procurement?
Exactly. That'd be fabulous if I could get that answer.
Got it. Thank you, Darren. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I derive so much energy from speaking to such inspiring guests and having really meaningful and challenging conversations. If you felt the same way, my ask of you is to please subscribe to this podcast, either here or wherever you download your podcast content from. Unbiased is a labour of love for me, and the impact that these perspectives have depend on reaching as many eyes and ears as possible. So your support is invaluable. Until next time, stay curious.